So we reached the final part on my series about Japan and World War II, and this is based on the book Hirohito and the Making of Modern Japan, which is a biography of the Showa Emperor. It's pretty interesting because it kind of tries to focus on his role in World War II itself rather than kind of World War II per se. And it's kind of interesting to look at what was happening behind the scenes. And the portion of the book that deals with the end of World War II and the post-war period is no exception. The kind of the narrative he gives is something very, very different from what I'm used to hearing. So, broadly speaking, I find the main narrative that's pushed by pretty much everybody, particularly by right wing people in North America, or I guess kind of right wing Westerners and right wing nationalists in Japan, is that the Japanese constitution, with all its democratization, the taking away of the emperor's powers, Article 9 and the pacifism clause, all of that was just enforced on Japan. That it was victor's justice. The Americans hated democracy, hated aristocracy. They hated the emperor system. They hated nationalism. And this was just kind of them establishing their new world order. And there's certainly aspects of truth to that. I don't think it's really questionable that America didn't want to spread liberal democracy, that they didn't want to set Japan up as a satellite state or a future ally, and that they weren't trying to establish a new global order with themselves at the head. I don't really think that's arguable, but I think the whole situation is a lot more complicated than it kind of at first looks. And something you have to keep in mind about Japanese nationalists is they have very, very little ability to self-reflect. So, like, a lot of them today still kind of claim to the narrative Japan did nothing wrong. And even if you say, like, from a moral perspective, they didn't, like, their wars were justified, they don't really think that domestically they did anything wrong during World War II. Once again, this was just kind of this. And it's interesting because the book actually says the Japanese have a natural disaster view of history where sometimes things just happen. Like wars just spontaneously happen. No one was responsible for it, etc. So that being said, let's kind of get into this. So the surrender process is something that's really opaque and kind of difficult to determine. Basically, by the end of the war, you had two factions. You had the control faction, which we had mentioned previously, that was made up of the militarists and the military centralists, who had kind of more or less taken over the government. Japan didn't directly have a coup. It just kind of gradually kind of became a totalitarian one-party state with the military leading it. But there wasn't really a coup. Actually, the faction that attempted a coup, the Imperial Way faction, had gotten purged. And they were kind of seen as being larpy and irrational and dangerous. But ultimately, it kind of turned out that the control faction was just as dangerous and irrational, if not more so. So there was just kind of massive deadlock as to what should actually happen. I mean, some of the hardliners were still maintaining Japan can still win this war. We're in a position where we're going to just kind of sacrifice millions of Japanese, and the Americans will take such heavy casualties, they'll have to come to some sort of a negotiated peace. They kind of really delayed and obfuscated past the point that they could have had any kind of terms. Now, I'm going to say I'm pretty critical in general of the Allied policy of insisting on an unconditional surrender from the Axis powers. I think they should have at least had them some terms, and kind of the author speculates but says he doesn't really think it would matter because one of the conditions they tried to include in any Japanese surrender would be the maintenance of the emperor system. And some people have suggested that if the U.S. had have offered a deal to the Japanese, the deal being that if they surrendered, at least they would be able to keep the emperor as the head of state. They might have surrendered sooner. I'm not entirely sure for the author's reasons, but he doesn't seem to think that that would have been the case. He seems to think that regardless of what wound up happening, whatever deal the Americans had offered, the Japanese just wouldn't have surrendered. Because they were trying this really lame, like 4D chess back channel maneuver where they were trying to get the Soviet Union to come to a separate peace deal. and maybe try to like hold out until the Soviets and Allies started fighting. It didn't really go anywhere, and it just made the situation worse. So eventually, they kind of decided to surrender, and very early on, and we'll get into this in a minute. The belief was that the emperor couldn't take the fall for this one, that he couldn't be held accountable for his role in World War II. Now, I actually kind of agree with this because in a state like this, the idea is the emperor is the monarch and he is the highest level of society. So, like, who can judge him aside from God, or I guess in this case, Amaterasu? There really isn't anybody. And sovereign immunity has kind of been a part of monarchy and kind of a part of international law and the international order since very, very long time ago. So I actually kind of agree with the idea of not going after the emperor. The other issue is it's just kind of politically impossible. But that kind of eventually came up, and the Japanese were like, okay, well, we have to finger somebody for this. So we're going to come up with the narrative that the civilian government wasn't involved, the emperor wasn't involved, the Japanese people weren't involved. It was like this military clique. It was the control faction. It was the general staff. They were the ones who did absolutely everything. Everybody else were good boys who didn't do nothing. And it's like, we'll get into this, and while this is somewhat dishonest, I think it was kind of necessary. And once again, this isn't really something the Americans alone came up with. The Japanese were already kind of moving in this direction. And like I said, we'll get into it in a minute. So Japan eventually surrendered. They had to, like, ultimately with the Emperor Showa, they had to like mistranslate the American surrender offer to make it sound like they'd be able to retain the emperor system. So that all happened. Now, the interesting thing, and from what I've read, I think Douglas MacArthur is still remembered fairly fondly in Japan today. Because when Japan surrendered, they expected the Americans to basically behave the way they had. So they expected the Americans to just come in, rape, burn, sack, pillage, destroy everything. And some people have said, oh, there were some rapes that happened. I'm pretty sure the U.S. Army punished those people, though. I mean, you're always going to have soldiers run amok and commit crimes. I'm pretty sure that wasn't official policy, and I'm pretty sure that those people were, like, punished. So I don't really see how that counts as a war atrocity, per se. I mean, societies have their own rapists. But I digress. So, like, there is this interesting kind of very Japanese thing. They're like, okay, so here's the plan. We're going to recruit an army of Japanese prostitutes, and they're going to throw themselves, and they're just going to take all the lusts of the foreign occupiers. And because it's going to be in a controlled area, we can make sure they use birth control and we give them abortions. And they're like, we have to prevent the miscegenation of the Japanese race. We must protect the purity of the race from Caucasian influences. It's kind of funny, like, just how racist the Japanese are. It's funny because when America took Okinawa as basically a military base, and the Japanese like objected, America said you're always complaining about how the Okinawans aren't Japanese and are an inferior race, so you shouldn't really mind us taking it off of your hands. And the Japanese Prime Minister was like, "Oh, he kind of has a point there." But anyway, so yeah, Douglas MacArthur showed up. And it's kind of interesting how well the occupation went. MacArthur's kind of is known for being very arrogant, very pompous, very unwilling to submit to political direction. And in this case, it's a good thing because, well, MacArthur's political views, I think, were a little complicated. I think calling him like an ultra conservative probably isn't that unfair. And he wasn't really interested in punishing Japan. He's like, we have bigger fish to fry. We don't want Japan to become a communist state. We don't want civil disorder. The real enemy is the Soviet Union. Japan's a beaten enemy. It reminds me of something Tywin said in A Storm of Swords. Joffrey, when your enemies defy you, you must serve them steel and fire. When they go to their knees, however, you must help them back to their feet. Elsewise, no man will ever bend the knee to you. So MacArthur was kind of, and this is kind of the same perspective Sherman had at the end of the Civil War, where he was fairly conciliatory after the war ended. He was a demon beforehand, but he kind of became conciliatory. Same thing with Grant. It's the war's over. We have to reintegrate the South. There's not a point in kicking a beaten enemy. That sort of thing. So MacArthur wasn't really interested in that. He wasn't really interested in getting rid of the emperor system, punishing Japan. It's kind of interesting because he references public opinion polls from the period a lot. It's something like 77% of the American public wanted Japan to be punished for a number of reasons, partially just in all wars, people want retribution. They were still angry about Pearl Harbor. Also, the Japanese had treated their prisoners of war horrendously, and they were not particularly happy about that. But pretty earlier on, kind of what MacArthur and the Emperor met, and kind of their staff met behind the scenes. And MacArthur's like, "Look, I have no interest in getting rid of the Emperor system. I'm going to get on board. I agree, like to maintain stability, to not allow communism to kind of grow. We're going to go with the plan of just fingering like a dozen or so military guys for everything, pretending they were behind everything, claiming that the Showa Emperor had no role in any of this, that he was a good boy who didn't do nothing." And they were kind of united on that. And that's kind of the interesting thing about the whole Japan was they were show trials, but they were mutually agreed upon show trials. And in particular, Tojo was going to be the one who was going to take the fall, which he was happy to do because it was a way of protecting his emperor. So Tojo was also very, very unpopular. So, like, I think part of the context you have to keep in mind when we're talking about post-war Japan is Japan had been in a state of total economic mobilization for well over a decade at this point. There was problems periodically with military overspending during the 1920s, but since the 1931, with the Manchurian incident, Japan had more or less been under constant, like I said, full economic mobilization. And the more power the army got over the government, the more and more they kind of turned everything towards defense production. So Japan had like virtually no economic growth since like the 1920s, and they were kind of deindustrializing in a sense. Not every country is like Germany or the United States or even Great Britain, where they're fully industrialized and they're able to retool a substantial amount of their industry to produce war goods while still having some civilian industry left. Japan had kind of shifted absolutely everything over to war industry, and their like population continued to grow and their army continued to grow while living standards continued to fall. I think by the end of the war, something like there was like 6 million plus men who had been conscripted into the army, which is a huge number. And once again, they all had to be fed and that kind of thing. The deprivations, even before like World War II started against America, and even before America bombed Japan into the Stone Age, the Japanese people suffered horrendous deprivations because they had to deal with continual conscription, the military police, and if you've seen the movie Letters from Iwo Jima, it's shown in this. The military police and the government would just randomly confiscate private property to help the war effort. Rations kept getting cut. They just kind of got involved in more and more wars, and none of it really seemed to be helping the homeland at all. From what the author says, the only reason Japan was able to fight in World War II at all was they had more or less become entirely dependent on like plundering China and their other areas under their occupation, and using the resources from there to like barely let their economy creep along. There was also horrific domestic oppression by a large, corrupt military police force. In particular, that's one of the main reasons the public really hated Tojo and like the later military governments was like even they just felt like the level of repression they were under was truly horrendous. And pretty much everyone had known at least a couple people who had died in one of the various wars. So what I'm trying to say is, okay, so the Americans wanted Japan to like democratize and become like more pacifist, sure. But it's not as if like the Japanese people at this point in time were like, rah, rah, let's rearm and let's go for round like 5. There was a widespread dissatisfaction with it. Also, while there was still respect for the emperor, this was starting to wane a bit because people were like, "Well, if he was responsible for this like unmitigated disaster, where we spent the last 2 decades and basically all of our country's economic and military resources and achieved pretty much nothing to show for all of it, then screw him." So the Constitution itself had a lot of input. From my understanding, the pacifism clause was suggested by the then prime minister. You also have to understand it's part of the whole narrative of the only people responsible were the military leaders. So the Americans and Japanese government adopted the same narrative that the civilians were always against the war. They had been tricked or forced into it. Militarism was bad. Japan had always been a country of peace. And like Japan, as I've said, is very two-faced with the rhetoric. So throughout like the 20s and stuff, they had said, "Oh, we renounce war. War is evil." And they were saying like all this pacifist stuff while they were invading China. So like it's not as if this stuff hadn't been said previously. And so you had both the Americans and the Japanese like demanding this. So the actual Constitution was, from my understanding, largely written by Americans, but with substantial Japanese input. I think originally they just wanted to resubmit the Meiji era Constitution, but the fear was, and this was once again both from the Americans and from the Japanese, that if they stalled too much and they tried to insist on too conservative a constitution, then the people would just not accept it at this point in time. Like they were saying that opinion polls showed something like, I'm just kind of ballparking this, less than a fifth of the Japanese wanted the Meiji era constitution re-implemented. A lot of them wanted a constitutional monarchy like Britain, and some even wanted a republic. So it's not like there was this huge like nationalist counterbalance who was screaming for things to go back to the way they were prior to Japan's defeat. People were tired, exhausted, they were sick of repression and everything else. And like I said, MacArthur was worried that if this went on too long, then they would like the situation would just degrade itself faster and faster. So they kind of did force the Constitution through. So I'm not saying the Allies didn't draft the Constitution and kind of pressure Japan to accept it, but in part it was a fear of trying to keep the country stable. So it was kind of at the time they thought in the best interests of the Japanese, and there was substantial Japanese support for it. It's not like liberalism wasn't a thing in Japan. During the 20s, you had the Taisho democracy movement, and there was a lot of people in Japan who did support liberal democracy. Keep in mind, democracy is a little bit different in a homogenous, largely conservative society. It doesn't have the same... The country can still act in a very unified way. Like, once Japan adopted democracy, it basically just became a one-party state ruled by a conservative party. And with, I think, only two exceptions, the Liberals, Democrats, and the Liberal Democratic Party have been in power pretty much since World War II. And a lot of its leadership are like members of the ex-military or heads of zaibetsus or stuff like that, or nobility. So, like, more or less in a lot of ways, the structure of government didn't really change that much. Social conventions were still very strong in Japan, and I think they've kind of gotten more conservative again since World War II in a lot of ways. But something that's often brought up is that the emperor had his powers stripped and was reduced to like a figurehead role. Now, this was partially the Allies didn't like monarchy. I'm not going to pretend that's not the case, particularly the United States. At the same time, though, the emperor was pushing this narrative. He had no power. He didn't do anything. And there was kind of an agreement between his staff and like the Americans that, okay, well, we have to make this a reality. So like the emperor doesn't have any power. So why would he have powers in the new constitution? It was I think the thinking. And it was like, so they took away the power, but part of it was to reinforce the narrative that the Showa emperor had no role in World War II and that he wasn't in control of the government, etc. So what I'm trying to say is, maybe I'm going too far in the whole like allies didn't do anything direction, but it's like something I think Japanese nationalists like refuse to like acknowledge, and even to this day, like there is I think a genuine fear because there were like conservatives even in like the post-war era who were anti-war and thought like Japan went too far. Some of the conservatives after the war said we failed because we abandoned our moral principles and we acted in like a really brutish way. But Japan never really self-reflected on any of the stuff it had done, either domestically or in terms of foreign policy. So I think there is a fear that if Japan ever does revoke Article 9 and becomes a great power again, the Japanese right hasn't learned anything from World War II, and they'll just immediately start attacking countries again. And people don't really want that, even within a lot of people, even within Japan. And truth be told, things ultimately worked out pretty well for them. Sure, they lost World War II and they lost all their colonies, but as a lot of European countries came to find, colonies in a lot of cases aren't really that helpful. They take up immense amounts of money to govern. You have to basically put them under military occupation. They require conscription in the homeland or some sort of like huge army to maintain. And Japan having its colonies stripped, sure, it reduced their ability to domestically access raw materials. And sure, it prevented them from really having an area to colonize, but it also meant Japan didn't have to pay the development and maintenance costs of the huge swaths of territory. They also demobilized virtually their entire army. As I said, like they went from having like 6 million men in the army to like a tiny fraction of that almost overnight. So all that money was freed up. Like they didn't have to spend money on that. They didn't have to spend money on a huge capital ship program. They didn't have to like just basically have their economy in a state of total economic mobilization. And MacArthur was very keen. Like I said, he wasn't interested in reparations or punishing Japan, and he very quickly worked with the Japanese to start the Japanese miracle and get the economy running again. And I mean, well, let's look at what the long-term impacts of it. Japan entered World War One as a World War Two as a newly industrialized country where people in the home islands were horrendously poor and the economy was in a constant state of collapse. And nowadays, they're one of the wealthiest countries on earth with I think they have the longest life expectancy of any major country. They have a very equal society in terms of economic wealth distribution compared to a lot of countries. There's a lot of other issues with Japan, like people working themselves to death. That's not really a result of World War II. That's just kind of a cultural thing. So, I mean, like, things didn't work out that badly. I mean, I guess people can say, oh, a lot of, like, social liberal stuff happened. But Japan's still pretty conservative. The problem with Westerners is when they look at, like, all the, like prostitution in Japan and, like, the hentai and stuff like that, you have to understand conservatism just kind of means something different in different societies. So the sexual thing isn't quite as big a deal in Japan as it is in the West. Japan is still Japanese. Japan's still like what 99.9% Japanese, and there's still a widespread commitment to maintaining the Japanese people and Japanese culture. Well, it's true that they've been a satellite state for America, and that's kind of changing. Once again, there's some benefits to that. America protecting them once again meant they didn't have to spend the money on maintaining a large army. They could just let the Americans basically do that, have a small self-defense force, and all the money could go into economic development. And it you can't really argue with success. So like ultimately, I think things worked out pretty well. A lot of people had to die, and a couple cities got nuked, and like half the country got firebombed, and there was a bit of a famine. But the end result is, I'd say, like a couple decades after World War II, Japan was in a much better state than they were when they entered it. And their demographic problems kind of resolved itself, more or less. Once the country was just overpopulated and industrialized, the birth rate just fell to current levels, and it's going to probably take a while to Japan's population declines. It'll probably start going up again after a while. But to be fair, like with regards to the birth rate in Japan, Japan is a country that's like legitimately overpopulated. It's very crowded. A lot of the land is just not good for farming. The Japanese are also pretty environmentalists, so they don't really want to like deforest large portions of the country on what's often mountainous or marginal land to like slightly increase their space available for human habitation. So probably what'll happen is a couple tens of millions of people will die off, and then the cost of living will feel and the birth rate will rebound a bit. So that's the end of my coverage of Hirohito and the making of modern Japan. If I feel inspired, maybe I'll edit these 3 videos together into like one big video and post it. But I thought that was pretty interesting. If people like this, next time I read a history book, I'll just give maybe some kind of running videos, kind of covering what I'm looking at, because I find this stuff all very fascinating. So once again, if you're looking for the book, it's called Hirohito and the Making of Modern Japan, and that is by, let me just bring it up. Herbert P. Bix. Anyways, so God bless everybody, and we'll talk to you later.